Hello, and welcome to the third week of Crime and Punishment. So we are talking this week about narrator. And there are some big takeaways from the fourth strand in the AP Lit curriculum. The most important one is simply that a narrator's perspective or a speaker's perspective controls the details and emphases that affect how you experience and interpret the text. Makes sense, but for some of their activities, including this week's, you really need to pause yourself and think about how the text is working on you because of the narrator's selection of detail. So we're going to focus on strands 4C and 4D, which are to identify and describe those details and understand the way that the narrators establish a relationship with you based on how the story is told. Then also how the tone is going to be a really important word this week, toward events or characters in a text influence your interpretation of those ideas. 4D is all about reliability. It's really a part of 4C in many ways because it's all about identifying, well, what are the details that are being revealed to me and what is the tone? But that does go into the reliability of the narrative. You can infer the narrator's biases by noting which details they choose and which details they omit. The reliability of the narrator might influence your understanding of a character's motives. So we've been with Raskolnikov for a couple of weeks, and it's a really good moment to pause and focus on his biases and his reliability, and we're going to do just that today. Now, I'm assuming that you know 4A, which is to identify and describe the narrator, because it's something that you've probably come up again and again against in your literature studies. And it's simply being able to identify, is this first person, third, second? So before I reveal it, just pause for a moment, even pause the video, and for yourself, identify what kind of narration is this? What is the point of view? It is assumed that you will be able to do that independently. So take a moment and make your best guess. Okay, so the narration is done in third person. And when it's in third person, there's three possibilities for how else it might reveal itself. It can either be objective. The narrator in these cases doesn't convey the thoughts and feelings of any character and is really neutral. A story that comes to mind that's very good at this is Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. It's a really neutral third person, a God's eye perspective where you never float into the mind of any character. So in that way, it's not a God's eye. It's more of a camera. There could also be limited. A third-person limited perspective is when the narrator knows, sometimes very deeply, the thoughts and feelings of one particular character, but we only get that one. Lastly, it could be omniscient. The narrator, in this case, knows the thoughts and feelings of many or even all characters. It would be impossible for a narrator to know everybody's mind that they put into a narrative. And so really, you can ask yourself, can they go into anyone's mind they wish to? Whether or not they do, can they? So take a moment, pause if you must, and ask yourself, which one's crime and punishment? It's actually not completely obvious at first, but we are very much in the world of the omniscient third-person narrator. And I think it's mostly in Raskolnikov's mind, and I think you'll probably agree with that, especially when he's in the scene. So if we're in a room with Raskolnikov, he's the one who we get to see. But the narrator dips into the minds of other characters, or even there's a neutral author who sometimes speaks. So it's not limited. I think you can make the case that there are long tracks of text where it is a limited third-person perspective, but the question is what the book is, and the book is omniscient third-person perspective. So right at the beginning of part 3, which is your reading for this week, there's like a 2 or 3 page long thought monologue inside the mind of Razumihin. And you get to see a little bit into Dunya's head as well. So if you didn't feel it already, you'll quickly begin to feel, oh wow, this narrator can float. We do get to hear from other people besides Raskolnikov. But it's mostly Rodya Raskolnikov. So let's consider that for a little bit, and that will very much influence our creative analysis. How does a narrator shape the story? Well, we are most often to see inside of Raskolnikov's mind, and the consequences of that decision are really these 4 prongs. No matter who your narrator is. It will impact the amount of information that you're given. It will impact the specific details that you're given. It will impact the words and the tone of the story. We'll hear it through mostly his tone. And it will raise suspicion of reliability. When you only have a lot of this coming from one character, naturally you'll begin to wonder, well, but what did other people think? Or now that you've established so clearly what you believe, how do we know that we can trust you? So let's look into that a little bit more deeply. The suspicion of reliability. Why might he be unreliable? And I say this almost ironically because he is clearly unreliable. And I see that in your comments from last week. There's a certain amount of unreliability for every single narrator you'll ever meet. Even a limited perspective or an objective perspective, third-person narrator. To be human is to be unreliable. We have biases. We can't combat them. So we have to be unreliable in some ways. Your task is to find out to what degree and in what way. There's 4 different ways that you could begin to understand this. Your narrator could be biased. Of course, Raskolnikov is biased. Bias is connected to motive, and so they might have ulterior motives. Raskolnikov will present this story with a very strong bias towards his own survival. And that's something he fights. So he has some integrity in my eyes because he does clearly fight it. There are moments where he says, I have to go confess this. I just have to get this off my chest. I did something awful. So that bias, though he wants to preserve himself, is something he recognizes as wrong. And there are other biases at work too. So bias, ulterior motives, they might be lying to us or to themselves. And we might be able to pick up on that deceit. But there could be deception that they're clearly laying out for us not even to find, or for other characters not to find. And in the scene that we'll look at today, that's really clear. So they're lying, Raskolnikov is lying to Porfiry Petrovich in the scene that I'll show you. And what will happen is we'll find that we're sort of rooting for him. We don't really want him to get found out. And when he gets mad at Razumihin, we get mad at Razumihin too. So that lying, that question of honesty, is a really complicated one for us, the readers, because we can see through it, and yet we also support him. It's challenging to figure out exactly what to think with this. So that's why we'll talk about it. And then lastly, the narrator might be unreliable because they are emotionally affected. And I think in this case, emotional is the word I'll use, but that contains the mental, the psychological, and the physical challenges that the narrator is going through. So the narrator here is an omniscient third person, but because so often they're floating inside of Raskolnikov's mind, and he has had a mental break, as Lila put it, and I think that's fair. He is so emotionally affected, he doesn't even quite remember what happened. This will also be true when certain characters admit so freely that they've been drinking. Razumihin in the first scene in part 3 says the word drunk 1,000 times, it seems, in the first 2 pages. So he is admitting, I am not in full control of my faculties. So we should be suspicious of the reliability of the narrative there too. All right, so 4 ways that you can question the narrator in front of you. And that is what I'd like you to do. This all matters in a deep way because when we get into the timed right this week, it will not ask you explicitly, why does all of this matter? But it will say, and how does that matter to the text as a whole? Which is their way of saying, so what? So you can't trust the narrator. So the narrator limits your perspective. So what? So why does this matter? Here are some ways that I imagine you could begin to take up that argument. What are the consequences of the decision of the third-person narration so often in Raskolnikov's head? Well, he has power over the story and over us. What is that going to do to the story, and what is that going to do to our relationship with Raskolnikov? His story has limitations. that we should be aware of. And those limitations include his biases and the ways in which he is unreliable. It also includes just his lack of knowledge. When he meets Porphyry in this scene that we're going to look at, we don't know what Porphyry thinks, and that's a limitation. For Rodya, it's definitely a limitation. He can't figure out if this guy knows that he committed murder. And for us, the reader, it is also a limitation because we aren't sure what will happen. Now that, of course, is the next one, that limitations build suspense. That third person omniscient narration is so powerful because the narrator could go into the mind of Porphyry, but the narrator doesn't. So there is this selective revelation of detail that builds suspense and intrigue in the characters and in the narrative. And then, lastly, because I'm asserting that Raskolnikov is so often the perspective that we get, the moments where he does not have power are especially important. So as you read, I'd like you to start really thinking about those little moments where Raskolnikov is not the one in control of the narrative. And yet, the creative analysis that I'm giving you today is one where he is very much in control of the narrative. And I do that because I think it represents so far most of what we've read. It's also a really important moment. So your creative analysis task is going to be practice for the first timed write. We've done a lot of untimed writes, but the timed write is different because you need to be very confident in attacking that prompt with a plan. So I want your creative analysis to be a little bit of a warm-up. And for that reason, we'll look at the passage today. This is what you're going to have to do on Wednesday, just a little preview. I'll leave that there and you can pause it, but then we'll come back to this on Wednesday. It'll be very much the task that you did last week, but instead of putting it in a bulleted and outline form, you will actually write the essay. You'll be looking for evidence. You'll be actually putting quotes into your argument. All right, so what we can do today is read the passage. And we're going to explore, for the timed write and for today, the passage where Rodya meets Porphyry Petrovich. I want you to write a short response after you've read it to these questions. What is interesting to you about the passage? And especially, what is interesting to you about the narration of the passage? This is here in the slideshow, and I will also put it in the email, and it will also be in your quick view. And you'll notice there is no prompt yet. There will be a prompt on Wednesday, but I'm not putting it in there yet. I also put in a second prompt if you're behind in the reading. I know this book can get a little bit heady at times, and it might be that it's got you buried under some outdated reading, and that's understandable. So if you're really behind, rather than jump ahead into this big moment, keep reading at the pace you're at, and instead select this alternative passage. This is from part 2. It's where Peter Lucin, Dunya's fiance, comes to visit Raskolnikov and introduce himself. The same skills apply, you'll still get a lot out of it. So I'd like you to pick passage 1, the first one that I've linked here. If you're caught up with the reading, I think it's a really important moment. But if you're not caught up with the reading, the second passage there is going to be just fine. And that's creative analysis. Thank you all.